True Alone in the Woods Horror Stories story. 1. The Whistler. I went camping alone in the Cascade Mountains last October. I know people say you should never camp alone, but I had done it dozens of times before without any problems. I was experienced, prepared, and honestly, I needed the solitude after my divorce. The lawyers, the arguments, the division of everything we had built together, it had all taken its toll. I needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere I could hear myself think. I arrived at the trailhead around noon on a Friday. The parking lot was empty, which was exactly what I wanted. I shouldered my pack, 40 pounds of gear, food, and water, and started up the trail. The first 2 miles were steep, winding through dense forest that smelled of pine and damp earth. My legs burned, but it felt good. It felt like I was leaving something behind with every step. After about 5 miles, I found a perfect spot near a small creek. The area was beautiful, surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a natural cathedral of green and shadow. The creek bubbled over smooth stones, and there was a flat area just big enough for my tent and a fire ring. I set up camp methodically, the way I had been taught years ago. Tent first, then gather firewood, then organize my food and gear. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that filtered through the canopy above. I made dinner, freeze-dried. Beef stroganoff reconstituted with creek water I had, filtered, and sat by my campfire as darkness fell. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared, and I pulled on an extra fleece layer. The forest grew quiet in that particular way it does at night, when the daytime birds settle and the nocturnal animals haven't yet emerged. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. Everything was perfect until around 10 at night. I was sitting by my campfire reading a thriller novel by the light of my headlamp when I heard it. A whistle, not a bird whistle or the wind through the trees. It was a human whistle, the kind someone does to get your attention. 3 short bursts, then silence. The sound was distinct, intentional, and completely out of place. I looked up from my book and scanned the darkness beyond my small circle of firelight. The woods were pitch black, impenetrable. I convinced myself it was another camper somewhere in the distance, even though I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, and there were no other vehicles at the trailhead. Maybe they had come in from a different direction. Maybe they were just letting me know they were there, being friendly. I went back to my book, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. 10 minutes later, I heard it again. 3 whistles, closer this time. Much closer. Close enough that whoever was making the sound had to be within 50 yards of my camp. I stood up, my heart rate increasing, and called out into the darkness. "Hello, is someone there? Are you okay?" No response. Just the crackling of my fire and the gentle sound of the creek. I grabbed my flashlight, a powerful LED that could throw a beam 200 yards, and shined it into the trees. All I could see were shadows and branches, pine needles, and darkness. Nothing moved. No one answered. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it was an animal making a sound that resembled a whistle. Maybe it was the wind creating some kind of acoustic phenomenon. Maybe I was more stressed than I realized and was hearing things. But I knew what I had heard. That was a human whistle. I decided to go into my tent and try to sleep. I banked the fire, hung my food bag properly to keep it away from bears, and zipped up the entrance to my tent. I lay in my sleeping bag with my knife within reach, a fixed blade knife I carried for emergencies. That's when things got really strange. The whistling started again, but this time it was right outside my tent. 3 short whistles, then silence. Then again. Then again. Each time the same pattern. 3 whistles, pause. 3 whistles, pause. It was systematic, deliberate, like someone trying to unnerve me, and it was working. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, my hand wrapped around the handle of my knife. Through the thin fabric of my tent, I could see a shadow blocking the moonlight that had been filtering through. Someone or something was standing right there, just inches away from me. The thin nylon wall was all that separated us. The whistling continued, always 3 short bursts over and over again. The shadow would shift slightly, but it never moved away. I could feel the presence of whatever was out there, could sense it watching me through the tent fabric. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 2. The shadow would move around my tent in slow circles, always whistling that same pattern. 3 short bursts. Pause. 3 short bursts. Pause. Sometimes it would stop at the entrance and I would hear breathing, deep, heavy breathing that didn't sound quite human. It was too slow, too measured, like something was deliberately controlling each breath. I lay there frozen, running through scenarios in my mind. If someone unzipped my tent, what would I do? Could I defend myself with just a knife? Should I try to call out again? Try to reason with whoever was out there? But something told me that would be a mistake. Whatever was circling my tent wasn't interested in communication. Around what I estimated was 2 or 3 in the morning, the whistling changed slightly. Instead of 3 short bursts, it became 3 long, drawn-out whistles. The sound was mournful, almost sad, but somehow more threatening. It reminded me of the sound someone might make when they're disappointed, when something hasn't gone according to plan. When the first light of dawn finally came, that gray pre-sunrise light that slowly brings the world back into focus, the whistling stopped. The shadow was gone. I waited another hour before I had the courage to unzip my tent and look outside. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to work the zipper. There was nothing there, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been near my campsite. But my firewood, which I had stacked neatly near the fire ring, was scattered everywhere, thrown across the campsite like someone had kicked through it in rage. And 3 of my tent stakes, the ones on the side where the shadow had spent most of its time, had been pulled out of the ground and tossed several feet away. I packed up everything as fast as I could, my hand still trembling, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. I just wanted to get out of there. I practically ran back to the trailhead, those 5 miles passing in a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow looked like a person. When I finally reached my car, I sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes, doors locked, just breathing and trying to calm down. I drove straight home without stopping, even though I had planned to be out there for 3 days. I never reported what happened. Who would I tell? The police? The Park Service? What would I even say? Someone whistled at me in the woods? They would think I was crazy or paranoid. I haven't gone camping alone since that night. I've been invited on group trips and I've gone on a few, but it's not the same. I can't relax. I can't enjoy the solitude I used to crave. And sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep in my own bed in my locked apartment, I still hear those 3 whistles in my head, 3 short bursts, then silence. Story 2. The Cabin in the Clearing. My name is Sarah, and I used to work as a wildlife photographer. It was my dream job, traveling to remote locations, spending days or weeks in the wilderness, capturing images of animals in their natural habitats. I had been doing it for 6 years, and I loved every minute of it. In March 2019, I was on assignment in the Appalachian Mountains, documenting black bears coming out of hibernation for a nature magazine. The assignment called for 2 weeks in the field, tracking and photographing bears as they emerged from their winter dens. I was deep in the forest, miles from any town or road, carrying all my gear in a 60-pound backpack. I had a tent, a sleeping bag rated for below 0 temperatures, freeze-dried food, water purification tablets, and of course my camera equipment. I was experienced and confident. I had done assignments like this dozens of times. On the third day of my trip, everything went wrong. I had been following a large male bear since dawn, keeping my distance but trying to get close enough for good shots. The bear was magnificent, probably 400 pounds with a thick winter coat he hadn't yet shed. I was so focused on getting the perfect photograph that I lost track of time and direction. When I finally looked up from my camera, I realized I had no idea where I was. The bear had wandered off, and I was in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. I pulled out my GPS unit to check my location, but the battery was dead. I had forgotten to charge it the night before, a rookie mistake that I couldn't believe I had made. My phone had no signal, which wasn't surprising this deep in the mountains. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. Dense trees, rocky outcroppings, patches of snow in the shadowed areas. The sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping fast. I needed to find shelter. I kept walking, hoping to stumble onto the trail or at least find a good place to set up my tent. That's when I saw the cabin. It was sitting in a small clearing, surrounded by overgrown weeds and dead trees that looked like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. The cabin looked old, really old. The paint was peeling off in long strips, revealing gray, weathered wood underneath. Several windows were broken, and the front porch sagged in the middle like it might collapse at any moment. But it had a roof and 4 walls, which was more than I would have in my tent. I decided to spend the night there instead of in the open forest. It would be warmer, and I would be protected from any wind or rain. The front door was unlocked and creaked loudly when I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. Inside, there was one large room with an old stone fireplace, a wooden table that looked homemade, and a single chair. Dust covered everything in a thick layer, and it smelled like mold and rot and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and unpleasant, but it was shelter, so I went inside and closed the door behind me. The door stuck a little, scraping against the floor, but I managed to get it shut. I set up my sleeping bag in the corner farthest from the door and ate a protein bar for dinner. I didn't want to start a fire in case the chimney was blocked. The last thing I needed was to fill the cabin with smoke or worse, start a fire I couldn't control. As darkness fell, I used my flashlight to look around the cabin more carefully. The furniture was minimal and old-fashioned, like something from 100 years ago. There was a shelf with some ancient-looking cans on it, their labels long since faded away. The fireplace had a pile of old ashes in it, but they looked decades old. That's when I noticed the scratches on the walls, deep gouges in the wood like someone had clawed at them desperately. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering all 4 walls from floor to ceiling. Some of them looked old, the wood around them darkened with age, but some of them looked fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored. My heart started pounding as I examined the scratches more closely. They were made by fingernails or something similar. I could see the parallel lines where fingers had dragged through the wood. Near the fireplace, I found words carved into the wood with something sharp. "Do not sleep here." The letters were crude but unmistakable. Someone had taken the time to carve a warning into the wall. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of the cabin immediately and take my chances in the forest. But when I looked out the window, it was completely dark. I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the glass. I grabbed my things and headed for the door, deciding I would rather risk the cold and darkness than stay in this place. But the door wouldn't open. I pulled and pulled, but it was stuck. I shoved my shoulder against it with all my weight, but it didn't budge even a fraction of an inch. I was trapped. Panic started to set in. I backed away from the door and shined my flashlight around the room, trying to stay calm and think rationally. There had to be another way out. The windows. I could break one of the windows and climb out. That's when I saw the faces. Pale, distorted faces pressed against the glass of every window, staring at me. There were 3 of them, maybe 4. It was hard to tell because they kept shifting position. They didn't move or make any sound. They just watched me with hollow, dark eyes. I screamed and ran to the back wall, pressing myself into the corner where I had set up my sleeping bag. The faces stayed at the windows, motionless, like wax figures. But they weren't wax. They were alive, or at least something that had once been alive. Hours passed. I couldn't take my eyes off them. Every time I blinked, I was afraid they would be closer, that they would somehow be inside the cabin with me. My flashlight beam moved from window to window, checking each face, making sure they stayed where they were. Then, around midnight, they started scratching at the windows. The sound was horrible, like nails on a chalkboard, but louder, more intense. Long, screeching sounds as fingers or claws dragged across the glass. The scratching got faster and more violent, and I could hear them at the door, too. The wood was splintering as something tried to force its way in. I grabbed my camera and started taking pictures, thinking maybe if I survived this, I would need evidence. The flash lit up the cabin in bursts of white light. In the photos, I could see the faces more clearly. They weren't quite human. The proportions were wrong, the features too sharp, too distorted. I don't remember much after that. I think I passed, out from fear, my body shutting down because my mind couldn't handle what was happening. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight was streaming through the broken windows. The door was wide open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. The faces were gone. I ran out of that cabin and didn't stop running until I found a trail. My lungs burned. My legs ached, but I kept going. Eventually, I made it back to civilization, to a small town where I called for help. I reported what happened to the local rangers, and they went to investigate. I gave them detailed directions, marked the location on a map as best I could. They searched the area I described for 3 days. They used GPS, they used search dogs, they used helicopters. They found nothing. No clearing, no old cabin, no evidence that any structure had ever been in that location. According to them, I must have hallucinated from dehydration or exhaustion or hypothermia. But I know what I saw. I downloaded the photos from my camera and they showed the cabin, they showed the faces. But when I looked at them the next day, they were corrupted. Just digital noise and distortion. The memory card had somehow been damaged. I still work as a photographer, but I don't take wilderness assignments anymore. I stick to studios, to urban environments, to places where I'm never more than a few minutes from other people. And I still have nightmares about those faces in the windows, about being trapped in that cabin, about the scratching sounds that seem to go on forever. Story 3. The tent that appeared. I was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail alone, doing a section in Northern California. It was late September 2020, and I had the trail mostly to myself. Most thru hikers, the ones attempting the entire 2,650-mile trail from Mexico to Canada, had already finished for the season. The weekend warriors and day hikers had gone home. It was just me in the wilderness, exactly the way I liked it. I had been on the trail for 12 days, averaging about 15 miles per day. My pack weight was down to 25 pounds now that I had eaten through most of my food. I would resupply in 3 days at a small mountain town where I had shipped a box of provisions to myself weeks earlier. Until then, I was rationing carefully, making sure I had enough calories to maintain my energy. I camped at a beautiful spot near a lake, surrounded by mountains that reflected perfectly in the still water. The elevation was about 7,000 feet, and the air had that crisp, clean quality it only has at altitude. There were no other tents or people around, which was exactly what I wanted. After almost 2 weeks of solitude, I had fallen into a comfortable routine. Walk all day, set up camp, eat dinner, watch the sunset, sleep. It was meditative, peaceful. I cooked dinner, ramen noodles with a packet of tuna mixed in, and watched the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. By 9 o'clock, I was in my sleeping bag, drifting off to sleep to the sound of small waves lapping against the shore. I woke up around 2 in the morning needing to pee. I crawled out of my tent, careful not to make too much noise, even though there was no one around to disturb. The moon was bright, nearly full, casting everything in silver light. I walked a short distance from my tent to relieve myself, looking up at the stars as I did. The Milky Way was visible as a bright band across the sky. When I turned back toward my tent, I noticed something strange. There was another tent about 50 feet away from mine, a blue tent similar in size and shape to mine. It definitely hadn't been there when I went to sleep. I was certain of it. I stood there for a moment, confused. I thought maybe another hiker had arrived late and set up camp in the dark. It was odd that they would camp so close to me when there was plenty of space around the lake. Trail etiquette usually dictated giving other campers a respectful distance, but I figured they must have had their reasons. Maybe they saw my tent and felt safer camping near another person. Maybe they were inexperienced and didn't know better. I went back to my tent and fell asleep, thinking I would introduce myself in the morning. But when I woke up, the blue tent was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there. No footprints, no flattened grass, no evidence of a camp. I checked the entire area around my campsite, walking in widening circles. I even walked around the lake to see if the tent had been somewhere else and I'd been confused in the darkness. Nothing. I convinced myself I'd been more tired than I realized, that I had dreamed the whole thing or been half asleep and seen a shadow or rock formation that my brain interpreted as a tent. I broke camp and continued hiking, putting in 17 miles that day. That night I camped at a different spot about 10 miles down the trail. I was in a small meadow surrounded by pine trees with a creek running through it. I went to bed early, exhausted from a long day of hiking with a significant elevation gain. Again, I woke up around 2 in the morning, and again there was a blue tent about 50 feet from mine, the exact same tent in the exact same position relative to my tent, off to the left side about 50 feet away. This time I knew I was awake. I pinched myself to make sure. I was definitely awake and that tent was definitely there. The moonlight illuminated it clearly. I could see the tent's rainfly, could see the shape of it, could see that it was staked down properly. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the blue tent, my heart rate increasing with each step. As I got closer, I could see there was something inside it. The tent was moving slightly, like someone was shifting around in their sleeping bag. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. I called out, trying to keep my voice friendly but loud enough to be heard. "Hey, hello. Is everything okay?" No response. The movement inside the tent stopped. I called out again, louder this time. "I'm a hiker. My tent is right over there. Just wanted to make sure you're okay." Still nothing. The tent was completely still now, but I could sense that whatever was inside was listening, was aware of me. I walked right up to the tent and shined my flashlight at the entrance. The zipper was closed from the inside, the pull tab visible on the interior side of the fabric. I reached out to touch the tent fabric, thinking maybe I would give it a gentle shake, try once more to get a response from whoever was inside. But when my fingers made contact with the nylon, I jerked my hand back immediately. The tent was ice cold. Not just cool from the night air. The temperature was probably in the mid-40s, but freezing cold. like it had been sitting in a freezer for hours. It was so cold it almost burned my fingers. The movement inside the tent stopped completely. Everything went completely silent. No crickets, no wind, no sound from the creek. It was like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire world. Then the zipper started to open. Slowly, inch by inch, something was unzipping the tent from the inside. I could not move. I was frozen in place watching the zipper slide down. My flashlight beam was shaking because my hand was trembling so badly. The beam danced across the blue fabric as the zipper descended. The zipper reached the bottom and the tent flap fell open. There was nothing inside. The tent was completely empty. No sleeping bag, no gear, no person. Just empty space. But I could hear breathing. Slow, raspy breathing coming from inside the empty tent. Each breath rattled like air being forced through a damaged windpipe. I ran. I didn't think, didn't rationalize, just ran. I grabbed my gear without even breaking down my tent and ran down the trail in the middle of the night. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that blue tent, from that breathing, from whatever impossibility I had just witnessed. I didn't stop until the sun came up. I hiked 20 miles that day, pushing myself to the point of exhaustion just to get away from that place. My feet were blistered, my legs were screaming in pain, but I didn't care. I needed distance. The blue tent appeared one more time 3 nights later. I was camped near a Forest Service road this time, close to civilization. I had convinced myself that what happened was some kind of hallucination, that the altitude and exhaustion had gotten to me. But at 2 a.m. I woke up and there it was again. The same blue tent in the same relative position, but this time there was something else. There was a figure standing next to the blue tent, a dark silhouette of a person perfectly still facing my tent. I couldn't make out any features. It was just a black shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the night. But I could feel it watching me. I packed up my stuff and hiked to the road in complete darkness using my headlamp to navigate. I didn't run this time. I forced myself to walk calmly, deliberately, even though every instinct screamed at me to sprint. I reached the road just as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. I flagged down the first car I saw, a pickup truck driven by an elderly man who looked concerned when he saw me stumbling out of the forest. He gave me a ride to the nearest town without asking many questions, though I could see the worry in his eyes. I never finished that section of the trail. I took a bus home and didn't go hiking again for over a year. Whatever that blue tent was, whatever was following me, I didn't want to find out what would happen if I stayed. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I wonder what would have happened if I had gotten closer to that figure. If I had tried to see its face, part of me is glad I never found out, but another part of me will always wonder. Story 4. The Footsteps. I am a park ranger in Montana, and part of my job involves doing solo patrols in the backcountry. It's one of my favorite parts of the job, actually. Most rangers prefer the visitor centers or the developed campgrounds, but I've always loved the remote areas. There's something peaceful about being days away from civilization, completely self-sufficient, just me and the wilderness. I've been doing this job for 11 years now, and I've seen a lot. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, wolves. I've dealt with lost hikers, medical emergencies, and illegal poachers. I've weathered storms in my tent, crossed swollen rivers, and navigated by compass when my GPS failed. I thought I had seen everything the wilderness could throw at me. In August 2020, I was doing a week-long patrol in one of the most remote areas of the park. The area was a vast wilderness, over 200 square miles without a single road or permanent structure. No cell service, no other rangers, just me and my gear. My job was to check on trail conditions, document any wildlife activity, and make sure no one was camping illegally or disturbing sensitive areas. On the 4th night of my patrol, I was camped in a valley between 2 mountains. The valley was about a mile wide, with a small stream running through it and scattered groves of aspen and pine. Before dark, I had hiked to the surrounding ridges and glassed the entire area with my binoculars, checking for any sign of other people. I was the only person around for at least 20 miles. The nearest trail, a rarely used path that most hikers avoided because it was so overgrown, was 5 miles away. I made dinner on my camp stove, mac and cheese with some dehydrated vegetables mixed in. I hung my food in a bear bag, suspended from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground and 15 feet from the trunk, exactly by the book. I checked my perimeter, made sure everything was secured, and settled into my tent around 9 o'clock. I was tired from a long day of hiking and fell asleep almost immediately. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Someone was walking around my tent. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves and twigs that carpeted the forest floor. Each step was distinct, measured, like whoever was walking was being very careful about where they placed their feet. I assumed it was a deer or maybe an elk. Large animals walk through camps all the time, especially near streams where they come to drink. I've had plenty of animals investigate my tent over the years. But then the footsteps stopped right next to my tent and I heard breathing. Human breathing. Someone was standing right there, just on the other side of the thin tent fabric, inches from my head. I called out, identifying myself as a park ranger and asking who was there. I tried to keep my voice calm and professional, but I could hear the edge of concern in it. "This is Park Ranger Matthews. Who's there? Is everything okay?" No response. The breathing continued, slow and steady. I could hear it clearly, could hear the slight whistle of air moving through someone's nose. They were breathing through their nose, not their mouth, which somehow made it more unsettling. I grabbed my radio from beside my sleeping bag and turned it on, but it was useless. I was too far from any repeater tower. The radio just hissed with static. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, shining it at the side of the tent where the breathing was coming from. Through the fabric, I could see a shadow, the shadow of a person standing perfectly still, cast by the moon behind them. Then the footsteps started again. They walked away from my tent, circled around behind it, and came back to the same spot, around and around my tent over and over. Each circuit took about 30 seconds. The pattern was consistent, methodical, like someone pacing while deep in thought. This continued for at least an hour, maybe longer. The footsteps would circle my tent, stop at different points, and I would hear the breathing. Sometimes the breathing would be right next to my head. Sometimes it would be at the foot of my tent. Sometimes at the entrance. Then the footsteps would start circling again. I didn't sleep. I sat in my tent with my flashlight and my can of bear spray, the most effective weapon I had. I had a folding knife too, but I didn't think it would do much good against whatever was out there. My service radio was useless and my personal cell phone had no signal. I was completely alone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another ranger doing an unscheduled patrol. Maybe it was a lost hiker who was disoriented and couldn't respond to my calls. Maybe it was someone with ill intentions who had seen my Park Service vehicle at the trailhead and followed me in. None of these explanations felt right, but they were better than the alternative, that there was something out there that wasn't quite human. When dawn finally came, that slow lightening of the sky from black to dark blue to gray, the footsteps stopped. I waited until I had full daylight before I opened my tent. My hands were shaking as I worked the zipper, and I had my bear spray ready. There were footprints everywhere, human footprints made by bare feet. They circled my tent dozens of times, exactly as I had heard. I knelt down and examined them carefully. They were adult-sized, probably a men's size 10 or 11. But the strange thing was the depth and spacing. The footprints were deep, like whoever made them was very heavy, but the stride length was short, like they were taking small, careful steps. But here's the disturbing part. The footprints didn't lead to or from my campsite. They just started at my tent and ended at my tent. I followed the circle of prints around and around looking for where they began or ended, but I couldn't find it. There was no trail showing where this person had come from or where they had gone. It was as if someone had materialized next to my tent, walked in circles for hours, and then vanished. I checked the surrounding area for any other signs. I walked in expanding circles from my campsite, looking for more tracks for evidence of where this person had come from. I found nothing. The ground beyond the immediate area of my tent was undisturbed. I broke camp immediately and hiked back to the ranger station. It took me 6 hours of hard hiking, and I didn't stop once. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but the trail behind me was always empty. I reported what happened to my supervisor, and she took it seriously. She sent a team of 4 rangers out to investigate the site. They found the footprints, photographed them, made plaster casts, but they couldn't explain them. There were no missing persons reports, no other campers in the area, nothing that could account for what I had experienced. The investigation went on for 2 weeks. They interviewed all the park staff, checked trail registers, reviewed permits. They even brought in a tracking expert from the sheriff's department. No explanation was ever found. I still do solo patrols, it's part of my job, and I love this work too much to let one incident drive me away. But I've never camped in that valley again. When my patrol routes take me through that area, I make sure I'm somewhere else by nightfall, and sometimes, when I'm alone in my tent at night in some remote corner of the park, I listen very carefully for footsteps. I lie awake for hours straining to hear any sound that doesn't belong. Most nights there's nothing but the normal sounds of the wilderness, but every once in a while I hear something that makes my blood run cold, and I wonder if whatever visited my tent that night is still out there, still walking in circles around lonely campsites, still breathing just inches away from terrified campers. 3-5 The Thing in the Trees. This happened to me in November 2018. I was hunting alone in the forests of Maine, about 30 miles from the Canadian border. It was the last day of deer season, and I wanted to find a good spot away from other hunters. I had been hunting that area for 15 years and knew it well, or thought I did. I'm an experienced hunter. I grew up in Maine, learned to hunt from my grandfather, and I've been doing it for over 25 years. I respect the animals, I follow all the regulations, and I'm careful about safety. I had hunted alone many times before without any issues. I preferred it, actually. Hunting with a group means coordination, compromise, too much noise. Alone, I could move quietly, set up where I wanted, stay as long as I wanted. I had taken a week off work specifically for deer season. I spent the first few days hunting from a stand I had set up on my property, but I wasn't seeing any deer. They had changed their patterns, probably due to hunting pressure. So on the last day, I decided to go deep into the public forest land, to an area I knew most hunters avoided because the hiking was difficult. I left my truck at dawn and hiked for 3 hours, climbing over rough terrain, crossing 2 ridges, navigating through thick underbrush. I found a small clearing that looked perfect. Good sight lines, signs of recent deer activity, and most importantly, far from any roads or trails. I set up a basic camp with just a tarp shelter and a sleeping bag. I planned to stay for 2 nights and then hike back out, hopefully with venison. The first day was normal. I spent most of it in a tree stand I had set up at the edge of the clearing, watching and waiting. I saw some squirrels, a porcupine, and several blue jays, but no deer. As evening came, I climbed down from my stand and returned to my camp. The temperature was dropping fast. It was down to about 25 degrees, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. I made a small fire, just enough to cook some soup and warm my hands. I was wearing heavy layers and wasn't too cold, but the fire was comforting. As I was eating, I heard something moving in the trees above me. I looked up and saw the branches shaking like something was jumping from tree to tree. It was too dark to see clearly, but whatever it was big. Too big to be a squirrel or a bird. Too big to be a raccoon or a pine marten. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it up into the trees. For just a second, I saw something. It looked almost human, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, hanging down past where the knees should be. And it was moving in a way that didn't make sense, swinging from branch to branch with an agility that seemed impossible for something that size. Then it disappeared behind the trunk of a large pine tree. I stood there with my flashlight pointed up, my heart pounding, waiting for it to reappear. Nothing. The branches stopped moving. The forest went quiet. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, shadows and branches creating an illusion. Or maybe it was a bear cub climbing in the trees, though I'd never seen a bear move like that before. I put out my fire, suddenly feeling too exposed with the light, and got into my sleeping bag, keeping my rifle close. It was a .308 Winchester loaded and ready. I'm not the kind of person who gets spooked easily, but something about what I had seen unsettled me deeply. I could still hear movement in the trees above me, branches creaking and leaves rustling even though there was almost no wind. Then it started making sounds. Not animal sounds exactly, but not human either. It was like someone trying to imitate human speech but getting it wrong. The sounds would start out low and guttural, almost like words being formed in a throat not designed for speech, then rise to a high-pitched screech that made my teeth hurt. Then they would stop suddenly and there would be complete silence, more oppressive than the noise. This went on all night. The thing would move through the trees, staying right above my camp. I could track its movement by the sounds. The creaking of branches, the rustling of pine needles, the occasional thump as it landed on a new branch. It would make those horrible sounds, stop, move to a different tree, and start again. The pattern was deliberate, methodical, like it was trying to keep me awake, trying to break me down psychologically. I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there in my sleeping bag, gripping my rifle, staring up at the dark branches overhead. Several times I almost fired a shot up into the trees just to drive whatever it was away. But I didn't. I'm not the kind of hunter who fires blindly into the darkness, and part of me was afraid that shooting at it would make things worse, would provoke it into doing more than just watching and making noise. The hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. I checked my watch obsessively. 2:47 a.m., 3:15 a.m., 4:02 a.m. Each minute felt like an hour. The temperature continued to drop and I was shivering despite my warm sleeping bag. Whether from cold or fear, I couldn't tell. When morning finally came, that gradual lightening from black to gray that signaled dawn, the sounds stopped. The movement in the trees ceased. I waited another 30 minutes before I had the courage to get out of my sleeping bag and look around. I looked up at the trees around my camp, and my blood ran cold. There were claw marks on the bark, deep gouges that went high up the trunks. Some of them looked old, the exposed wood weathered and darkened, but some of them looked fresh, the wood light colored and sap still seeping from the wounds. Whatever had been up there had claws and was strong enough to dig into solid wood that would be hard for me to cut into with a knife. The gouges were too high for a bear to have made, at least not from the ground. And they were in patterns that didn't match any animal I knew. They looked almost deliberate, like scratch marks made with purpose rather than the random scratches an animal might make while climbing. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking so badly I kept dropping things. I didn't bother with breakfast or even coffee. I just wanted to get out of there. I started hiking back the way I had come, moving as fast as I could while still being careful not to twist an ankle on the rough terrain. I had only gone about a mile when I realized something was following me. I would hear branches breaking behind me, always just out of sight. The sounds would stop when I stopped, start when I started walking. It was tracking me, matching my pace, staying hidden in the thick forest. I picked up my pace, almost jogging through the forest. My pack bounced awkwardly on my back and my rifle kept getting caught on branches, but I didn't care. The sounds behind me got closer. I could hear whatever it was crashing through the undergrowth, no longer trying to be quiet, just keeping pace with me. Several times I spun around with my rifle ready, finger on the trigger, safety off. But I never saw anything, just trees and shadows and the thick undergrowth. But I knew it was there. I could feel it watching me, could sense its presence in the forest around me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs burned from the exertion. I had been hiking for what felt like hours, but was probably only 90 minutes. I still had at least another hour and a half before I would reach the logging road where I had parked my truck. The sounds behind me were getting even closer now. I could hear heavy breathing, could hear the snap of branches being pushed aside by something large. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I burst out onto the logging road. The moment my boots hit the gravel, the sounds behind me stopped. Everything went silent. I turned and looked back into the forest, my rifle raised and ready. Standing at the edge of the tree line, partially hidden in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. It was thin, impossibly thin, with arms that hung down past its knees, just like I had glimpsed the night before. Its body was covered in matted fur or hair, dark brown or black. But the worst part was its face, or what I could see of it. It looked almost human, but stretched and distorted like a human face pulled onto a skull that was the wrong shape. We stared at each other for what was probably only seconds, but felt like minutes. I had my rifle aimed right at it, my finger on the trigger. I could have taken the shot, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the uncertainty of what exactly I was looking at. Maybe it was the knowledge that shooting it might not stop it. Maybe it was just the primal fear that froze my finger on that trigger. Then it stepped back into the shadows and was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I ran down that logging road, my heavy pack bouncing, my rifle clutched in both hands until I found my truck. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them twice before I managed to get the door unlocked. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in the driver's seat and started the engine. I drove away from there, doing 50 miles an hour down that rough logging road, not caring if I damaged my suspension. I didn't slow down until I hit the paved highway 20 miles later. I haven't been back to that part of the forest, and I never hunt alone anymore. I joined a hunting group, 4 guys I've known for years, and we always stay together now. They probably think I'm paranoid for insisting we never split up, but I don't care. I've tried to research what I saw, spending hours online looking at reports of strange creatures in Maine forests. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, about Wendigos, about all kinds of cryptids and folklore. Nothing quite matches what I saw, but there are enough similar stories that I know I'm not the only one who has encountered something like that. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, still watching from the trees, still waiting for another hunter to wander into its territory. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made it to that logging road. If I had been slower or tripped and fallen. I try not to think about it, but the image of that thing standing at the tree line haunts me. I see it when I close my eyes. I see it in shadows, and I know I'll never forget it. Story 6. The voice from the lake. Last summer I went kayaking by myself in the boundary waters of Minnesota. It's a huge wilderness area, over 1 million acres of pristine forest and water with thousands of lakes and islands. I had been kayaking there for years and knew the area well. It was one of my favorite places on earth, a true wilderness where you could paddle for days without seeing another person. I had a week off work and decided to do a solo trip, something I did every couple of years. There's something special about being completely alone in the wilderness, about the self-reliance and the silence. I loaded my kayak with a week's worth of food, a tent, a sleeping bag, water filtration gear, and all the other equipment I needed. I paddled out to a remote lake that required 3 portages to reach. Portaging, carrying your kayak and gear overland between lakes, is hard work, especially when you're doing it alone. Each portage was about a quarter mile, which meant multiple trips back and forth to move all my gear. It took me most of a day to reach my destination, but it was worth it. I knew I would be completely alone out there, far from the more popular routes that casual paddlers used. I set up camp on a small island in the middle of the lake. The island was only about 100 feet across, just a rocky outcrop with a few pine trees and enough flat space for my tent and a fire ring. It was perfect, isolated, beautiful, surrounded by clear water that reflected the sky like a mirror. The first night was perfect. The sky was clear, filled with more stars than you can ever see near civilization. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. I sat by my small campfire, ate dinner, and listened to the occasional call of a loon, that haunting, trembling sound that echoes across northern lakes. I fell asleep to the gentle sound of water lapping against the rocky shore of my tiny island. I woke up around 3 in the morning to a voice calling my name. It was coming from the lake, from the direction of the mainland about 200 yards away. The voice was calling Sarah, Sarah over and over again, in a sing-song pattern that sounded almost playful. It sounded exactly like my sister's voice, not similar, exactly like it. I would know my sister's voice anywhere. We've been close since childhood, and I've heard her voice in every emotional state imaginable. This was her voice, no question about it. But my sister was back home in Ohio. She had no idea where I was camping. I had told her I was going to the Boundary Waters, but I hadn't given her specific details about which lakes or islands, and there was no way, absolutely no way, she could be out there in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. She didn't even own a kayak. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding, listening. The voice kept calling my name, always from the same direction. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. Each repetition was the same tone, same inflection, same slight pause between repetitions. I unzipped my tent and looked out across the water. I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The moon was just a sliver, providing almost no light. The voice continued calling. Sarah, help me. Sarah, please help me. Now it sounded exactly like my sister when she's scared or upset. That slight break in her voice that she gets when she's crying. I knew it wasn't really her. It couldn't be. But the voice was so convincing, so perfectly mimicking her voice that part of me wanted to get in my kayak and paddle over there to check. Part of me was genuinely worried that somehow, impossibly, my sister was out there and needed help. But something told me that would be a terrible mistake. Some instinct deeper than logic warned me not to respond, not to acknowledge the voice, not to go anywhere near wherever it was coming from. I stayed in my tent, listening to that voice call my name for almost 2 hours. Sometimes it would sound close, like it was right next to my tent, just on the other side of the thin nylon wall. Other times it would sound far away, coming from across the lake or from the other side of the island. But it never stopped. It just kept calling and calling. Sometimes just my name, sometimes pleading for help, sometimes saying things like I'm so cold or I can't find my way back. Every word, every phrase sounded exactly like my sister. The voice even used expressions and phrases that were uniquely hers. At one point it said, Sarah, please, I'm scared, using the exact same words and tone she had used when we were teenagers, and she had called me during a thunderstorm when our parents were away. Then, as suddenly as it started, the voice stopped. The silence was almost worse. I sat there in my tent waiting, my sleeping bag pulled up to my chin, my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. Minutes passed, maybe 10 or 15. The silence stretched on, broken only by the gentle lapping of water. Then I heard splashing in the water like something swimming toward my island. The splashing got closer and closer, steady and rhythmic. Whatever was making the sound was a strong swimmer, moving purposefully through the water. I could track its progress by the sound. It was definitely heading straight for my island, not just passing by. The splashing got louder, closer, until I could tell it was only about 20 feet from shore. Then I heard it pull itself out of the water onto the rocky shore of the island. The sound was distinct, the scrape of something being dragged across rocks, the wet slap of something heavy and sodden hitting stone. Then I heard footsteps, wet and heavy, walking around my tent. Around and around, just like the footsteps that Ranger heard in Montana. Just like the whistler who had circled that camper's tent in the Cascades. The pattern was the same. Slow, deliberate circles, stopping at various points, then continuing. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I could hear water dripping, could hear the wet squelch of each footstep. Whatever was walking around my tent was soaked, dripping water with each step. The footsteps continued circling my tent, and I counted the circuits, 7, 8, 9 times around. Then they stopped at the entrance of my tent. I heard breathing, heavy and wet, like someone who had just climbed out of deep water and was struggling to catch their breath. Each breath was a ragged, gurgling sound, like lungs filled with water trying to draw in air. Then the voice spoke again right outside my tent entrance, so close I could have reached through the fabric and touched whatever was speaking. Sarah let me in. It still sounded like my sister, but there was something wrong with it now. Something cold and hollow underneath the familiar tone, like a recording being played through damaged speakers. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I didn't even shift my weight. I just sat there frozen, every muscle rigid with fear. My mind was screaming at me to do something, to run, to fight, to call out. But my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed by terror. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. Then finally the footsteps moved away from my tent. I heard them walking back toward the water, heard the splash as whatever it was entered the lake, heard the steady rhythm of swimming as it moved away from the island. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in my tent with my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, watching the tent entrance, waiting for those footsteps to return. Every small sound made me jump. A fish breaking the surface, a branch creaking in the wind, the call of a loon in the distance. As soon as there was enough light to see, that gray pre-dawn light that slowly reveals the world, I packed up everything and started paddling. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. I just loaded my kayak as quickly as I could and started the long journey back to the trailhead. It took me 6 hours of non-stop paddling and portaging, but I didn't care. My arms screamed in pain, my back ached, but I just kept going. I needed to get out of there, needed to get back to civilization, needed to be around other people. When I finally reached the trailhead and loaded my kayak onto my car, I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just shaking. My hands trembled so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. When I got home, I called my sister to make sure she was okay. She answered on the second ring, sounding confused about why I was calling in the middle of the day on a Wednesday. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm at work. Why? What's wrong? You sound weird." I told her I just wanted to check in, that I had been thinking about her. I didn't tell her what happened. How could I? She would think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy, but I know what I heard. That was my sister's voice, perfectly replicated, calling to me from across that dark water. Whatever that voice was, it knew things. It used phrases and expressions that only my sister would use. It knew my name. It knew how to sound scared and desperate in exactly the way that would make me want to help. I haven't been back to the Boundary Water since then. I've sold my kayak. People ask me why, and I make up excuses. I'm too busy, I've moved on to other hobbies, I'm getting too old for that kind of trip. But the truth is, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if I go back, I'll hear that voice again. And I'm afraid that next time, I might not be strong enough to stay in my tent. I might get in my kayak and paddle toward that voice, and then I don't know what would happen, and I never want to find out. Story 7. The camera. I am a nature photographer, and in October 2021, I spent 2 weeks alone in the Olympic National Forest in Washington. It's one of the most beautiful places in North America. Temperate rainforest, dramatic mountains, and incredible wildlife. I was documenting the fall colors for a gallery show I had coming up, and I also hoped to get some shots of elk during rutting season. Photography has been my profession for 12 years. I've traveled all over the world, often working alone in remote locations. I've photographed polar bears in Alaska, jaguars in Brazil, and lions in Kenya. I'm comfortable in the wilderness, careful about my safety, and experienced with camping in all kinds of conditions. I set up a base camp in a small clearing about 4 miles from the nearest trailhead. From there, I would hike out each day to different locations, sometimes covering 10 or 15 miles, returning to my tent each evening. It was an efficient system. I didn't have to move my base camp every day, and I could cache food and extra equipment there. On the 5th day, I was photographing a waterfall about 3 miles from my camp. It was a beautiful location. The water fell about 40 feet into a clear pool surrounded by moss-covered rocks and ferns. The fall colors were perfect, and I spent several hours there getting shots from different angles and with different exposures. I set up my camera on a tripod to get some long exposure shots of the water. Long exposures, sometimes 30 seconds or even minutes, create that silky smooth effect where flowing water looks almost like fog. While I was waiting for an exposure to finish, I decided to review the photos I had taken earlier that day on my camera's display screen. I scrolled through the images, shots of the waterfall, some mushrooms I had found, a distant elk I had spotted, but then I found something that made my blood run cold. There were photos on my camera that I didn't take. They were pictures of my tent, taken from different angles in the woods surrounding my campsite. The photos were taken at night, based on the darkness and the strange quality of the light. In some of the photos, I could see the glow of my headlamp inside the tent, which meant these pictures were taken while I was in there. Someone had been standing in the woods photographing my tent while I was sleeping inside it. My hand started shaking as I scrolled through more photos. There were at least 20 of them, all taken over what looked like several nights. The photographer had gotten closer to my tent in each series of photos. The first ones were taken from maybe 50 feet away, the tent visible through the trees. The middle ones were taken from about 20 feet away, the tent more prominent in the frame. The last photo showed my tent from about 10 feet away, close enough that I could see individual stitches in the fabric. I could see my shadow inside through the tent wall, see the outline of my sleeping bag. I checked the timestamps on the photos. They had been taken between midnight and 3 in the morning over the past 4 nights. Someone had been creeping up to my tent every night while I was sleeping and taking pictures, but the camera had been in my tent with me every night, right next to my sleeping bag. I always kept it close because it was expensive equipment. How was this possible? Then I realized the horrifying truth. Someone hadn't been using my camera. They had been taking photos with their own camera and somehow putting them onto my memory card. Or maybe, and this thought was even more disturbing, they had swapped my memory card with another. One while I was sleeping or while I was out during the day. Frantically checked my camera bag and found 3 memory cards that I didn't recognize. They were the same brand as mine, SanDisk 64GB cards, but they weren't the ones I had brought. My cards had small identification labels on them with my initials. These cards had no labels. I inserted one of the unfamiliar cards into my camera and turned it on. There were hundreds of photos on it, I scrolled through them, my horror growing with each image. More photos of my tent, taken over multiple nights, photos of me cooking dinner, sitting by my fire, filtering water from a stream, photos of me hiking on trails, completely unaware that I was being photographed. Some of the photos were taken from very close enough that I should have noticed someone nearby, but I hadn't. The most disturbing photos showed me sleeping in my tent. The camera must have been just inches from the tent fabric to get such clear shots through the nylon. I could see my face in some of them, my eyes closed, completely vulnerable. The flash had been turned off, but somehow they had gotten enough light to make the images clear. I checked the other two unfamiliar memory cards. They contained even more photos going back weeks or possibly months based on the changing seasons visible in the images. And these weren't just photos of me. There were photos of other solo campers, men and women of various ages, all photographed in the same way. Sleeping in their tents, cooking their meals, hiking trails, completely unaware they were being stalked and photographed. I felt sick to my stomach. I packed up my equipment with shaking hands, not bothering to be careful or methodical like I usually was. I just shoved everything into my bags and started hiking back toward my camp. I needed to get my things and get out of there immediately. I needed to get to a place where I could call the police, where I could report this. But as I walked, a terrible thought occurred to me. If this person had been visiting my tent every night, they knew exactly where my camp was. They had been there multiple times. They might be there right now, going through my things, waiting for me to return. I approached my campsite carefully, staying off the trail and moving quietly through the trees. I circled around to approach from an unexpected angle, moving from tree to tree, stopping frequently to listen and watch. When I got close enough to see my tent, I stopped and observed for several minutes from behind a large Douglas fir. My tent was unzipped and open. I had definitely zipped it closed that morning, I always did, to keep insects and small animals out. All my gear was scattered around the campsite. My sleeping bag had been pulled out of the tent and was lying on the ground, slashed to pieces. The fabric was cut in long, deliberate slashes, the insulation spilling out like guts. My food bag had been cut down from where I had hung it and torn open. Food scattered everywhere. My extra clothes had been pulled from my backpack and arranged in strange patterns on the ground. But worse than the destruction was what had been added. There were dozens of photos pinned to the trees around my campsite. They were printed photos, not just digital images, which meant this person had a portable printer or had made multiple trips in and out of the forest. They were pictures of me, sleeping in my tent, cooking dinner, sitting by my fire, hiking on the trails, filtering water, changing clothes, eating breakfast. Every mundane activity of my camping trip had been documented and was now displayed around my destroyed campsite like some kind of sick art installation. I didn't go any closer. I turned around and hiked straight to the nearest trail that would take me out of the forest. I didn't stick to the main trail. I was afraid whoever had done this might be watching the trail, waiting for me. Instead, I bushwhacked through the forest using my compass and GPS to navigate. I hiked for 8 hours straight, pushing through exhaustion and fear, not stopping until I reached a ranger station just before dark. The rangers I talked to took my report seriously. They called the county sheriff, and within an hour, there were multiple law enforcement officers listening to my story. I showed them the memory cards I had found, and their expressions grew grimmer as they scrolled through the photos. They sent a team to investigate my campsite that same evening, even though it would be dark by the time they got there. They found my tent and gear, all destroyed just as I had described. They also found the dozens of photos pinned to the trees. They carefully collected everything as evidence, photographing the scene extensively. They also found something I hadn't noticed: boot prints around my campsite, lots of them going back and forth from the trail. They were able to make casts of several clear prints. The memory cards I had found contained hundreds of photos. not just of me but of other solo campers over what looked like several years. The technical analysis team was able to determine that the photos went back at least 3 years, based on metadata and the changing seasons visible in the images. The person who did this had been stalking people in that forest for a long time, maybe even longer than the photos indicated. The investigation lasted for months. They never found who did it. There were no fingerprints on the photos or memory cards. Whoever did this had been careful to wear gloves. The boot prints were from a common brand of hiking boots sold in millions of pairs. The cameras used to take the photos were also common consumer models that couldn't be traced. They did identify some of the other victims from the photos and were able to contact several of them. None of them had realized they were being photographed or followed. All of them were disturbed to learn what had happened, that someone had been watching them, stalking them, while they thought they were alone in the wilderness. I still take photographs in the wilderness, it's my profession, and I love it too much to give it up completely, but I never go alone anymore. I always bring an assistant now, usually another photographer or sometimes a friend who just wants to go camping. We take turns staying awake at night, especially for the first few nights in a new location. I check my memory cards obsessively several times a day, making sure there are no photos I don't remember taking. And I've installed a small security camera in my tent, the kind that activates on motion detection and saves video to a cloud server. If anyone approaches my tent at night, I'll have a record of it. The camera gives me some peace of mind, though I still don't sleep well when I'm camping. Every small sound outside my tent wakes me, and I lie there in the darkness, wondering if someone is out there with a camera watching, waiting, taking pictures of another solo camper who has no idea they're being stalked. The case is still technically open, though I doubt they'll ever solve it. Whoever did this was too careful, too experienced at avoiding detection. They're probably still out there in some other forest, following some other photographer or hiker, documenting their every move with a camera, collecting memory cards full of photos of people who think they're alone but aren't. And that thought terrifies me more than anything else. Not that it happened to me, but that it's probably still happening to others who have no idea they're being watched.